Some men seem to have everything: wealth, fame, power, and yet no one to come home to. And some women have nothing left but a song, a child, and pride. One winter night in New York, those two worlds crossed paths, not to save each other, but to realize that sometimes true love comes from the most unexpected places. This is the story of Gary Bellamy, the man in the glass tower, and Tamia Charelle, the woman who lost everything, yet taught him how to love himself again. A long journey through 10 seasons of emotion, from cold to warmth, deceit to truth. If you believe love can heal every wound, listen. New York at night was like a piece of metal forged in fire, radiant, cold, and so beautiful it hurt. Gary Bellamy stood still on the 47th floor of Bellamy Tower, gazing down at the streaming lights below, a sleepless river of motion. He could see everything: the flickering billboards of Times Square, the endless flow of cars pulsing like the city's bloodstream, and countless lives he would never touch. Behind him the penthouse glowed, but not for anyone. No laughter, no voices, no trace of real life. Only expensive paintings on the walls and the digital clock marking the time of a man who no longer knew why he existed. Gary exhaled, holding a glass of amber whiskey. That dark liquid had been his only companion for years, the one thing that helped him forget. He was slowly dissolving inside the flawless shell people called success. Every inch of Gary's life had a price tag. A 300-square-meter apartment, tailored Italian suits, limited edition watches of which only 10 existed worldwide, could be measured, exchanged, and owned. Except for one thing: feeling. It had left him long ago, like an old friend unwilling to stay in a house too spotless, cold, and orderly. His phone vibrated. On the screen, Mother. Gary closed his eyes and answered. "Gary, have you read the file on Miss Campbell?" His mother, Patricia, spoke with her usual polished, detached tone. "She just finished her MBA at Stanford, you know. Perfect match for your position. And more importantly, her father is the chairman of Campbell Pharmaceuticals, a perfect alliance for Bellamy Tech." Gary said nothing. His mother never waited for answers. She never needed his consent, only his compliance. "You're 34, Gary. The board is starting to ask questions. A man who has everything but no family, it makes the shareholders uneasy." Her words landed softly but echoed deep. He murmured, "Mother, maybe. Marriage shouldn't be a business investment." "You're talking like a dreamer," she replied dryly, then hung up. No goodbye, no warmth. Silence returned. Gary looked around. The floor-to-ceiling glass walls reflected his image. A handsome face, weary eyes, a practiced smile for the press. He looked like a perfectly crafted wax figure, shaped like a man, breathing like one, but soulless. He sank into the sofa and played an old jazz record. A saxophone's thick, melancholic sound filled the room like smoke. Each note reminded him of a time when he could still feel, still tremble at something small, like when, as a boy, he'd cried at the sight of a fallen bird in the garden. That was the last tear he was ever allowed. That day, his father had said, "Bellamy's don't cry. Emotion makes you weak. Let others feel. Your job is to control." And from that day, Gary learned silence. He succeeded brilliantly, loudly, but inside, he was hollow. Tonight, the city glowed as always, yet something felt different. Maybe it was the wind sweeping in from the Hudson, carrying the chill scent of freedom. Perhaps it was the whiskey losing its numbness, or maybe he no longer wanted to die slowly inside his golden cage. He stood, pulled on a leather jacket, the only thing he owned that wasn't custom-made, bought impulsively 10 years ago from a small shop in Brooklyn. As the elevator doors closed, the lights reflected his face, unfamiliar, yet more real than ever. 47, 46, 45. The red numbers dropped like the heartbeat of a man being revived. When he stepped outside, the cold air struck his face. At 3 a.m., New York was no longer the dazzling city praised in magazines. It was the real one, where the weary slept on benches, 24-hour diners reeked of old coffee, and lost souls searched for warmth in the dark. Gary breathed in deeply. For the first time in years, the wind felt real. And within that wind, he heard it, a voice. The sound was fragile as mist, Yet it pierced through the noise of the city, a song sad, raw, and strangely pure. Gary stopped, searching. At the far end of a dim alley, beneath a fading streetlight, sat a woman wrapped in an old coat, holding a child close to her chest. Her voice was unlike any music he'd ever heard. No technique, no rhythm, just truth. She sang as though speaking to her soul and the child asleep in her arms. Gary walked closer, careful not to break the moment. He saw the boy tiny, serene, his small hand clutching his mother's sleeve. Gary had never known how she looked at him with deep and steady tenderness. In that instant, he understood. This was what money could never buy: unconditional love. When the song ended, Gary said softly, "Your voice, it's beautiful." The woman looked up. The light fell across her face, dark skin, luminous eyes. But what struck him most wasn't her beauty, but the calm in her gaze. She didn't flinch, didn't shrink back, just looked at him as though she'd seen many faces like his before. "Music costs nothing," she said, her voice low and warm. "But it feeds the soul when the body has nothing left." Gary hesitated, then, out of habit, took out his wallet. "I can help." She looked straight at him, and the faint smile vanished. "I don't want your money. I'm not singing for pity." Gary felt his power slip away for the first time in his life. A woman with no home or wealth met his eyes as an equal, perhaps even above him. He put the wallet away and bowed his head. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to offend you." She nodded lightly. "It's all right. Just don't mistake compassion for condescension." The wind blew again. A few early snowflakes drifted down. Gary stood there, watching mother and child framed in that small pocket of light, realizing it was the first beauty he'd ever seen without luxury, without artifice. He asked her name. "Tamia," she said. "And you?" "Gary. Gary Bellamy." She smiled faintly. "I'm guessing you've never walked these streets before." "Probably not. But I think I'm meant to be here tonight." A long pause. Then Gary spoke without thinking. "Do you believe in fate?" Tamia didn't answer right away. She looked at him, her eyes deep as the night, and said, "I believe people appear when we need to see ourselves again. Maybe that's what we're doing tonight." Gary smiled this time. The smile reached his eyes. From afar came the echo of a car horn. The wind carried the faint scent of cheap coffee from a corner diner. The city kept moving, relentless as ever. But in the middle of it all, a wealthy man and a proud, penniless woman stood still, listening to the same thing for the first time in years, the sound of their own hearts. That night, the wind from the Hudson cut through the city like ice, as if New York wanted to test the endurance of those still awake. Tamia sat there, beside her little boy. She pulled an old blanket over his shoulders, her voice humming softly, unclear whether she was lulling him to sleep or soothing herself. Gary stood a few steps away, listening. Something unfamiliar stirred in him: warmth, pain, and a thin, trembling thread stitching together a part of him long severed. Her song had no studio, no audience, only honesty and survival. He asked quietly, "Who do you sing for?" Tamia looked at him, then at the child in her arms. "For this little one. And for God, if he's still listening." Gary said nothing. The wind swept through his hair, carrying the scents of exhaust and pastries from a street cart across the road. The child stirred, murmuring in a sleepy voice, "Mama, I'm cold." Tamia held him tighter, removing her coat to cover his shoulders. Such a small gesture, simple, instinctive, yet it made Gary's throat tighten. He had never seen love so pure, needing no words, no proof, just presence. "What's his name?" he asked. "Elijah," Tamia replied, eyes still on her son. "It means God is my promise." She said it was not like a sermon, but a quiet reminder that the world still held something good. Gary sat beside her, the space between them no wider than a breath. The city hummed behind them, but the night felt strangely still within their small circle. "Do you live here?" "Wherever I can still be called home, that's where I live. I work at a food station during the day, then find somewhere safe to sleep at night." "Alone?" "No. With him." She smiled softly at her son. Gary didn't know what to say. He had signed contracts for buildings larger than this block and commanded thousands of employees. Yet now he couldn't find the right words for a woman with a thin blanket. He reached for his wallet reflex of a man used to solving everything with numbers. But Tamia met his eyes steady, calm. Don't. I don't need your money. I just want to help. If you really want to help, then listen. Sometimes, what people need most isn't money, it's to be seen. Gary lowered his hand, shame flickering across his face. She was right. He'd spent his life buying everything from attention to silence. He'd never truly listened to anyone, not even himself. After a while, Tamia asked, "What do you do for a living?" "I build things people dream of owning, but no one actually needs." She laughed, a dry, quiet sound. "Then you're more like me than you think. I sing for people who don't want to listen but need to feel." They sat together, two wanderers from opposing worlds, talking like old friends reunited on a strange night. A gust of wind shattered the air, scattering snowflakes like tiny shards of glass. Tamia looked up, watching them fall onto her hair. "Have you ever thought snow is like people?" "How so?" "Each flake is different, but they all melt the same when they touch the ground." Gary looked at her. In her eyes, he saw something he lacked: a faith in life, even when life had been merciless. "You make me feel small," he said softly. "No," Tamia replied. "You've just forgotten how to see from the ground." They stayed until the city began to wake. Streetlights faded, replaced by the pale shimmer of dawn creeping between the buildings. A new day was coming, but neither spoke, afraid to break the fragile quiet. Tamia rose, lifting Elia in her arms. "I have to go. There's a little church nearby. They serve free breakfast." Gary stood quickly. "Wait. Let me take you there. My car's close." "That's not necessary. I'm used to walking." "But it's cold. And your son." Tamia turned to him. "Do you know what's most dangerous for someone like me, Gary? Believing that someone's kindness is real." Her words struck him silent. She said them gently, not bitter, not accusing, just as a sad truth. Gary watched the two figures disappear down the damp street after the snowfall. Something stirred in his chest, not pity, but awakening. He couldn't focus all day. During meetings, through endless emails, her face and that husky, tender voice replayed in his mind like a refrain. That night, he stood by the window again, the same city, the same million lights, but now they felt emptier than ever. And then he heard her voice in memory. "Don't mistake compassion for pity." Gary understood. For the first time, he wanted to help, not out of duty, but because the human in him longed to connect. He grabbed his coat and left, ignoring the guard calling after him. Outside, the snow was falling heavily. He followed the same streets toward Union Square. Only wind and a few street sweepers remained. Tamia was gone. He searched through block after block until he heard it again, that voice, faint but familiar, echoing from a narrow alley. She was singing the same song from last night, but weaker, weary. Elijah lay asleep on a worn wooden bench, his tiny hands curled tight. Gary stepped forward. "Tamia." She looked up, a flicker of surprise, then calm. "What are you doing back here?" "I don't know. Maybe because, for the first time, I want to understand someone instead of analyzing them." Tamia studied him for a long moment, then said quietly, "If you really want to understand, don't look at me as someone to save. Look at me as someone who might teach you how to live." Gary nodded. "Teach me." She smiled faintly, not quite trust, but no longer guarded. "All right. But the first lesson isn't easy." "What is it?" "Learn how to listen to silence." She turned back and kept singing. The melody blended with the wind, dissolving into the night air. Gary closed his eyes. For the first time, he heard the real pulse of the city, the footsteps, the wind, the breath of a mother, and the beating of his own heart. In the heart of New York, where no one stops for anyone, a billionaire and a homeless woman sat side by side, sharing a single, quiet moment, the kind the world would never understand. That sometimes, one song can save both the listener and the one who sings it. In the days that followed, Gary couldn't work anymore. Every report, every number, every meeting lost its meaning. All that remained in his mind was Tamia, the voice that cut through the night wind, the steady gaze, the way she held her child as if she were holding the whole world. He tried to reason with his emotions, but the more he thought, the less sense it made. He, a man who once planned billion-dollar mergers to the minute, couldn't control his heart. On the third night, he returned to Union Square. She wasn't there. The fourth, still nothing. By the fifth night, the snow was falling heavily. He almost gave up until he heard the singing. This time, Tamia's voice was weaker, trembling from the cold. She was singing to a small group of other homeless people, weathered faces, rough hands, yet their eyes were warmed by her song. Gary stood still, watching. When she stopped, he stepped forward. "Tamia." She turned, surprised for a moment, then smiled. "I guess you're not the type to give up easily." "No. I've just never found anything worth coming back for. Until now." She looked at him, half wary, half curious. "Why do you keep coming here? I have nothing for you to take." "I didn't come to take. I came because I have nowhere else to go." Tamia was silent. Her eyes searched him to test whether he meant what he said. For a few seconds, there was only the sound of the wind. Gary took off his coat and placed it over her shoulders. She moved to remove it, but he said softly, "I'm cold. Help me stay warm." She looked at him, then gave a faint, incredulous smile. He sat beside her again, and they watched the cars drift by together. For a long time, neither spoke. "Have you ever thought," Tamia said quietly, "that sometimes one wrong moment can change everything?" "I have," he said, "but I've never dared to be wrong." "Then I pity you." The words slid into him like a soft blade. Gary gave a rueful smile. "Maybe I need to learn how to be wrong." Tamia tilted her head toward him. Snow landed on her shoulders, glimmering under the streetlight. "Then start by forgetting what you're trying to protect." "I don't understand." "Power, reputation, your name. Those are chains, Gary. You'll never truly live if you're afraid to lose them." He fell silent. No one had ever spoken to him like that. No one dared. But from her, it all felt true. Finally, he asked in a low voice, "If I told you I wanted to change, would you believe me?" "No," she said plainly, "but you can prove it." "How?" Tamia looked at him, calm and unflinching. "Do the craziest thing you've ever done. Not for anyone else, just because you want to feel alive." Gary smiled, a strange mix of fear and relief. He looked at her, voice barely above a whisper. "Tamia, if I told you I wanted to marry you, would you think I'm insane?" She froze. The wind stopped. The snow seemed to fall more slowly, like the whole world held its breath. Then Tamia laughed. "You really are crazy. A billionaire proposing to a homeless woman on the street. That could be a movie." "I'm not joking," Gary said, his voice trembling. "I don't know why. I know that with you, I feel real. For the first time in my life." She stared at him for a long moment. Her eyes softened, then darkened again. "What are you looking for, Gary? Forgiveness? A story to make you feel like a better man? Or just a way to escape yourself?" "No. I'm looking for a reason to believe I still have a soul." Tamia said nothing. His answer wasn't what she expected, yet it wasn't something she could reject. "And if tomorrow you wake up and regret this, I'll still want you there to remind me that tonight I dared to live honestly." She smiled faintly. "Gary, you don't know what you're saying. Maybe not, but I know I want to begin again with you." Tamia looked at him with the eyes of someone who'd lost too much. "Do you even know what marriage means? It's not a piece of paper. It's a promise that you'll still stand there even if the world turns its back tomorrow. Can you promise me that?" Gary nodded. "I can." Tamia was silent. The glow of a distant sign lit her face, catching in her dark, sorrowful eyes. "You know," she said softly, "I've been proposed to before. I thought I'd found someone who would stay. But the next morning, he was gone. He left a note that said, 'I'm sorry. I don't dare to love you.'" She lifted her gaze to his. "I lost everything because of love. My family, my dignity, my future. Since then, I stopped believing in promises." Gary listened without interrupting. He only nodded. "Maybe he lacked courage, but I want to try." Tamia smiled faintly, shaking her head. "You don't understand. You come from a world where love can be bought with fine dinners and diamonds. I come from one where people survive on faith alone. Then let me cross into your world." She looked at him, moved but composed. "And you'd give up everything? If that's what it takes, yes." Tamia exhaled slowly. Gary, I don't want pity. If you came here to save someone, return to your glass tower. I don't need saving. I know, he said softly. I don't want to save you. I want to be saved by you. This time, Tamia was silent for a long while. The wind died. Only the sound of 2 heartbeats filled the cold air. At last, she said quietly, if I say yes, you'll have to live as I do. No servants, no cars, no fame. Only your hands and the truth. Can you handle that? I don't know, Gary admitted, but I want to try. Tamia smiled, shaking her head. Then we have a deal, Gary Bellamy. No contracts, no pity, no empty promises, only truth. Gary nodded and extended his hand. I promise. She placed her hand in his small, dry, but warm. In that moment, something ancient within Gary, something he thought long dead, stirred back to life. He looked at Tamia and whispered, thank you for giving me the chance to be wrong. Tamia smiled. And thank you for not being afraid to see me as I am. They stood, walking side by side through the snow-covered street. Neither spoke again. Above them, the first light of dawn crept between the buildings. The city was still cold, but something had finally begun to warm in Gary's heart. That morning, when Tamia stepped through the gates of Bellamy Tower, she felt as if she had entered another world, gleaming, vast, and cold enough that even the air seemed to have its emotions regulated. The doorman looked her up and down, then at Elijah's small hand clasped in hers. Their eyes flickered with curiosity and disbelief. Gary, however, remained composed, as though walking a homeless woman and her child into the tallest building in Manhattan was the most natural thing in the world. As the elevator doors closed, Tamia caught her reflection in the mirrored wall, pale face, dry lips, worn clothes. She gave a faint smile, half weary, half defiant. Are you sure you know what you're doing, Gary? She asked quietly. Never been surer, he said. When the doors slid open, a world of gold awaited them. Marble halls, antique paintings, chandeliers scattering light like stars. Tamia said nothing. She wasn't afraid. But it was clear this place wasn't made for her. Elijah ran to the window, pressing his face against the floor-to-ceiling glass. Mama, are we in the clouds? The question made Gary smile. You could say that, kiddo. Tamia joined him at the window, looking out. All of New York stretched below, streets like thin veins, people like moving specks of dust. It's beautiful, she murmured. But from up here, everything feels so far away. Gary understood. He took her hand, gently. You'll get used to it. No, Tamia said softly. You're the one who needs to. The news spread like wildfire. Billionaire Gary Bellamy marries a homeless woman. Love story or PR stunt? From the streets to the skyscraper. Who is Tamia Charelle? Every financial paper, gossip blog, and TV channel carried her name. In a matter of days, Tamia became the most talked-about woman in the city. Gary didn't care, but his mother did. On the third morning, Patricia Bellamy appeared in the grand dining room. She always brought a chill that seemed to lower the temperature of any space she entered. Tamia was pouring milk for Elijah when Patricia's voice rang out from behind. So this is the woman you said you'd marry? Gary turned, positioning himself between them. Yes, Mother. This is Tamia, and this is Elijah. Patricia glanced at the boy, then at Tamia, her gaze carrying not hatred, but something worse, pity laced with contempt. I must admit, Gary, you've always known how to get the press talking. Tamia stayed calm. She set down the milk and said evenly, Pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Bellamy. I never thought I'd say this, Patricia replied coolly, but my son seems to have a taste for the unconventional. Perhaps because he's had too much of the artificial, Tamia answered, her eyes steady. The room fell silent. Gary exhaled softly. He knew both women were strong, and this clash was only the beginning. Patricia rested a manicured hand on the table, her voice sharp. Do you really think you can live in this world? Here, everything has rules. I've lived where there were none, Tamia said with a small smile. So I'm not afraid to learn a few. Patricia's eyes flickered, then she turned to her son. Gary, you're risking the family's reputation over a whim. Mother, Gary said slowly, if what you call reputation means forgetting how to be human, Then maybe I don't need it. Something trembled in Patricia's gaze before she turned and left the room, leaving a silence heavy enough to press on the air. Tamia looked at Gary. You didn't have to say that. You shouldn't have to stand there alone. Gary, she said softly, I don't need protection, just respect. In the following days, Tamia learned how to exist in this glittering new world. A world of lights that never dimmed, smiles sharp as glass, and compliments that cut like knives. She went with Gary to lavish dinners, wearing dresses chosen by stylists, sitting among women draped in diamonds and pride. Every word on those tables was placed like a chess piece. Miss Charelle, one of them said in a voice sweet enough to freeze, I heard you used to be a street performer. No, Tamia replied. I just sang to keep my soul warm. The table fell silent. A few women smiled, those brittle, polished smiles of people who'd forgotten how to feel. Gary watched her with quiet pride. She didn't try to please them. She didn't bow. She was honest, unpolished, real. And that made him love her more. After the dinner on their way home, Gary asked, Are you okay? Tamia smiled faintly. I'm fine. I've slept outside in winter. A few looks won't kill me. Gary took her hand. I'm sorry for dragging you into this world. Don't be, she said softly. I walked in by choice, and I'll walk out on my own if I have to. He looked at her for a long time. You know, he said, sometimes I think you're the one saving them, all those people so rich they've forgotten how to feel. Tamia chuckled, slipping off her heels. Maybe, but they don't want saving. She looked out the window at the city still blazing with light. As for me, Gary, I just want to hold on to what's left of our humanity before this brightness swallows it whole. He gently wrapped his arms around her, as if afraid to break something fragile. You won't lose it, Tamia. I promise. She rested her head against him. Don't promise. Just stay when I need you. That's enough. Outside, snow was falling again. In the penthouse high above the city, two people from opposite worlds were learning how to love, not through words, but by staying beside each other amid 1,000 doubtful eyes. But beneath the 47th floor, the rumors, the schemes, and a media storm were already gathering, one that could sweep everything away. Winter in the Hudson Valley lasted longer than anywhere else. In the early mornings, mist clung to the window panes like a thin layer of memory. The wind down the hallways in that vast mansion felt like someone whispering through time. Tamia always rose early. She was used to waking before dawn, mixing milk for Elijah, then sitting by the stove. The kitchen, once meant for lavish parties, had become the smallest yet warmest corner of the house. Gary walked in, hair tousled, sweater rumpled, no trace of the polished CEO left. He smiled when he saw her whisking eggs. You're up early. I'm used to it. If you woke late on the streets, someone else took the good spot to stay dry. Gary fell silent. He didn't know what to say, so he only moved closer, watching her pour batter into the pan. The scent of pancakes filled the air, rich, homey, almost unreal. You don't have to do this, he said. There are people here for that. I know, Tamia replied. But I don't like letting others do what I can do myself. She turned and smiled, a quiet smile that somehow melted the last traces of cold still lingering in the house. Gary helped her set the table. He was clumsy, nearly spilled the milk, and she laughed. Looks like you've never been in a kitchen before. I have, Gary said, hesitating. When I was little, before my father decided Bellamy men didn't need to cook. He taught you a lot, huh? He taught me how to win, but not how to be happy. Tamia didn't ask more. She just looked at him in a way that said she already understood. In the days that followed, their rhythm changed. Gary left the office early and came home for dinner with Tamia and Elijah. He grew used to the smell of food, the sound of laughter, the music that floated through the house. He was astonished that these small, ordinary things brought him more peace than any boardroom. One evening, as Tamia folded blankets in the living room, Gary sat beside her. Do you ever think, he asked softly, that we come from two different planets? She chuckled. Of course, but it seems our planets are learning to share the same orbit. He smiled faintly, then asked, do you regret it? Regret what? Saying yes to me, stepping into this life. Tamia set the blanket down and looked straight at him. Regret is a word people use to escape their choices. I'm not escaping. I chose this. Gary looked at her for a long moment. He wanted to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Tamia tilted her head slightly. What about you? Any regrets? He smiled, so quietly only she could hear. No, nothing's ever felt this right. That night, snow fell thick outside. The three of them sat in the living room, the fire casting a golden glow across their faces. Elijah slept on the couch. Gary and Tamia sat still, watching the flames. Do you think love is something people can learn? Gary asked. No, Tamia said softly. Love is something people remember. Remember? Yes, we're all born knowing how to love. But growing up, we forget. When we meet the right person, we learn to remember again. Gary went quiet. He'd never heard anything like that. He watched her, the reflection of the fire deep in her eyes, calm and endless. You make me feel, he said slowly, like everything in life is worth starting over for. Tamia smiled gently. Then start. He nodded. They sat in silence, the snow falling outside, the fire burning low, a stillness the world beyond would never understand. Gary took Tamia to the old greenhouse behind the estate the next day, which was once his grandfather's garden. It had long since fallen into ruin. Broken glass, dry vines, wild grass. This used to be where my grandfather taught me that everything of value takes time, Gary said. But I forgot. Tamia walked along the cracked glass panels, sunlight catching her hair. Then let's plant again. Plant what? Anything that can live. They began clearing the garden. Gary, who hadn't touched soil in 20 years, knelt, his hands covered in dirt. Tamia laughed and said he looked ridiculous. He laughed too, telling her she looked like she was bringing spring back. Days later, small green shoots began to rise from the ground, fragile but alive. I like how nature teaches patience, Tamia said. Gary looked at her. You're teaching me that too. Me? Yes. You're teaching me to wait, listen, and stop trying to control everything. Tamia's eyes softened. Then you're a good student. Gary smiled, brushing a smudge of soil from her cheek. The gesture was simple, natural. They looked at each other, silent, no need for words. Then he whispered, Tamia, I think I'm in love with you. She didn't seem surprised. She only lowered her gaze. I know. You know. Women always know. And you? He asked quietly. Tamia lifted her eyes, dark, deep, unwavering. I don't know if I dare to love again, but maybe you're the reason I want to try. Gary smiled, his eyes warm. He took her hand and squeezed it gently. Then let's try. She nodded. They stood together in the sunlit greenhouse. Outside, snow still covered the ground, but within those glass walls, spring had already begun. As Tamia lulled Elijah to sleep that night, Gary stood at the door watching them. He had never seen anything so beautiful, not the kind of beauty born of gowns or chandeliers, but the quiet beauty of peace, of a woman who had lost everything and was finding herself again through love. He stepped closer and sat beside her. You know, he murmured, sometimes I think, you didn't walk into my life. I was the one invited into yours. Tamia smiled softly. Then stay. I will. Outside, the wind grew stronger, as if warning of something coming. But inside that small room, only warmth, candlelight, and two people slowly learning how to love through truth, their scars, and faith. March. Hudson Valley was slowly shedding the grey chill of winter. The snow melted, revealing damp brown earth, and water dripped from the eaves with the whisper of spring. Tamia loved this time of year. She rose early, went to the greenhouse, and watched the first shoots push through the soil. There was something redemptive about seeing life rise again. It made her feel forgiven, even though no one had spoken a word. Gary stood behind her, holding 2 cups of hot coffee. Think these little things will survive? He asked. If they have light and patience, she said, everything can come back to life. He watched her in silence. Tamia's face looked strong and delicate in the morning light, like mist given form. But behind her calm, he sensed something unspoken, something she'd never told him. Tamia, Gary said softly, is there something you haven't told me? She turned, a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. "How many times have you asked me that?" "Until you answer." Tamia set the pot down and exhaled. "I thought I could let the past sleep, but maybe you deserve to know." Gary nodded, waiting. She looked out the window, her voice quiet and deliberate. "I wasn't born poor, Gary. I'm from Georgia, the Wells family." Gary frowned slightly. "Wells, as in Wells Corporation?" Tamia nodded. "Yes. My family owned the largest textile company in the region. My father was a businessman, my mother a pianist. I grew up in a 12-room house, went to private school, and was taught that a lady never lets her hands touch the dirt." She gave a small, wry smile that mocked her memories. "But when I grew up, I met someone. He wasn't from our world, just a music teacher. He taught me melodies beyond the rules, about freedom, about being real. I loved him with everything I had." Gary listened, silent. "When my parents found out, they were furious. They called it a disgrace. They said, 'Love doesn't feed the family's pride.' I didn't listen. I left home for him." She paused. The wind brushed loose strands of hair across her face. "But when the world got real, he changed. Pressure, money, the future, it scared him. One morning, he was gone. Left a note that said, 'I'm sorry, Tamia. I don't dare to be poor with you.'" Gary bowed his head, fists tightening. "Don't blame him," she interrupted gently. "He just chose the path most people do. I don't hate him. It's just, after that, I stopped believing in promises." She turned to face him. "I was already pregnant with Elijah when I left Georgia. My family called it a disgrace. I never went back. I stayed in New York, sang in churches at first, then on the streets. For a while there was work. Then there wasn't. But I still had my son, so I didn't fall." Her voice trembled slightly, but no tears fell. "Maybe people only become strong when they no longer have a choice." Gary said nothing. He knew wounds like these didn't need fixing, they just needed to be seen. He stepped closer, taking her hand. "You're not someone who needs saving, Tamia. You're the one who saves others, including me." She looked up at him. "Gary, what hurt most wasn't being poor, hearing people say I'd lost my worth. I used to believe them, until I met you." Gary shook his head. "No, you found your worth long before I came along. I was just lucky enough to see it." Tamia smiled for the first time softly, genuinely. "I never thought you could say things like that. I didn't know I could. You made me learn." They stood there, listening to the birds outside. Sunlight streamed through the glass, touching their joined hands. Outside, spring had truly arrived. That afternoon, Gary returned to his Manhattan office. He glanced at the financial headlines. Bellamy Tech reports record first quarter profits. He smiled faintly, but the old emptiness returned. Numbers no longer made him happy. Only the image of Tamia in the greenhouse brought him peace. Meanwhile, Tamia sat by the window at home, writing in a small notebook. The words came in fragments, not a diary, but a way to keep her voice alive. She wrote, "If love is freedom, then forgiveness is its root. Perhaps you must face your own darkness first to love someone truly." Elijah ran in, throwing his arms around her. "Mama, I saw a rabbit in the garden." Tamia laughed, lifting him. "Maybe it's looking for spring, too." She didn't know that a new storm was gathering in the city. Someone had recognized her from old photos online, the woman who once bore the name Wells. That evening, Gary came home. He told her about his grandfather, Charles Bellamy, and how he'd once left a will that said, "To inherit everything, my grandson must marry before 35. Tamia smiled faintly. "So I came just in time, huh?" "No," Gary said. "You came when I needed to understand that marriage should never be a condition." She was quiet for a moment. "Do you think people will believe that?" "They don't have to," he said. "Only you do." Her gaze softened. "I believe you, Gary. But the world out there won't forgive someone like me so easily." Gary took her hand. "Then I'll learn how to fight the world if I have to." That night, they sat together in the greenhouse. A light wind moved through the glass panels, and moonlight fell like a silver veil around them. Tamia rested her head on his shoulder. "Do you ever think the past can come back to bite us, no matter how far we run?" "If it does," Gary said quietly, "then we won't run this time." She smiled faintly. "I hope so." The night air turned colder. She shivered, and he pulled her closer. From afar came the soft hum of the Hudson River, steady, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. They didn't know that, even at that very moment. Old photos of Tamia as the Wells heiress were spreading across the internet, accompanied by a headline that read, "The woman who pretended to be poor to marry a billionaire." And once again, the world they thought they had left behind was opening its doors, ready to pull them back into a storm no one could stop. On the second Monday of April, New York woke to an earthquake in headlines. Across the front page of every major newspaper, bold letters screamed, "Tamia Charelle, the mysterious wife of billionaire Gary Bellamy, is actually the missing heiress of the Wells dynasty. The woman who pretended to be poor to marry a billionaire. A scandal or a perfect plan?" Social media erupted. Hundreds of posts, comments, and videos flooded every feed. Photos of Tamia in glittering gowns from her life in Georgia resurfaced the smiling young woman. In those pictures looked nothing like the street singer the public had once pitied. Gary read the news in his office. He stood frozen before the screen, feeling like a hand had closed around his heart. He had known this day would come, but not with such cruelty. His phone rang endlessly, journalists, investors, old friends, and his mother. Everyone wanted an explanation. He turned it off and drove straight to Hudson Valley. Tamia was sitting on the sofa, her face strangely calm. The TV flickered in front of her. On Morning Talk Live, the host's voice dripped with sarcasm. A woman who once lived in luxury pretended to be homeless, then married one of America's richest men. If that's not a modern fairy tale, it must be a masterful scam. Tamia turned off the TV. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She was simply quiet. When Gary walked in, she looked up and said softly, "I guess they know." "I'm sorry, Tamia. I should have seen this coming." "Don't be sorry, Gary. The past doesn't need hiding, it must be told truthfully." He sat beside her. "We can stay silent. The storm will pass. I'll have PR take care of it." Tamia shook her head. "No, Gary. If I stay silent, I permit them to speak for me. I'll speak for myself." "What will you say?" "The truth. Not to justify, but to reclaim my voice. You don't have to face them alone." "I do. This time, it's for me." 2 days later, Tamia agreed to appear at a special press conference in New York, her choice not to fight, but to stand. The room was blazing with flashlights. Hundreds of reporters packed in, microphones raised, cameras clicking like rain. Tamia stepped onto the stage. She wore no designer label, no heavy makeup, just a simple white dress and an unshaken gaze. When the noise settled, she began, her voice steady and low. "I am Tamia Alexandria Wells Charelle. Yes, I was born into wealth. And yes, I walked away from it." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. She paused, then continued, "I didn't run because I was poor. I ran because being rich made me forget who I was. I didn't pretend to be poor to marry anyone. After losing faith in everything false around me, I just wanted to live honestly." She looked straight into the sea of lenses. "When I met Gary Bellamy, I didn't know who he was, and even if I had, I wouldn't have needed his pity. Love isn't charity, it's a choice." A reporter stood up. "Do you think you deceived the public?" Tamia smiled faintly. "I don't owe the public an explanation for how I live, but I owe myself honesty. I used to fear judgment. Not anymore. When you know who you are, what others think stops mattering." The room went silent except for the relentless clicking of cameras. In the back row, Gary rose. He walked onto the stage, took Tamia's hand, and said clearly, "She deceived no one. If anyone's been living a lie, it's me, the man who thought he understood truth because he owned it. Tamia taught me that real worth doesn't live in wealth, it lives in courage." A few people began to clap. Then more. Soon the room filled with applause, scattered at first, then swelling like a wave. Tamia turned to Gary, her eyes glistening but her smile unwavering. She whispered, "Thank you for standing beside me when the world turned away." He replied softly, "I don't have a world without you." That evening, they returned to Hudson Valley. The house was quiet, no reporters, ringing phones, or cruel headlines. Tamia sat by the window, watching the last snow melt in the garden. "You know, Gary," she said quietly, "when I stood there speaking, I was terrified. But then I thought, if I've spent my whole life trying to please others, then today, just once, I needed to speak for myself." Gary smiled, sitting beside her. "I'm proud of you." "No," she said gently. "Don't be proud. Be grateful that you love a woman who knows who she is." He laughed softly. "I do. And I know you're stronger than the world itself." Tamia leaned her head against his shoulder and closed her eyes. "I'm tired, Gary. I don't know where this will lead." "We don't need to know. We keep walking." She smiled faintly. "You always make things sound so simple. Because I've lived a life complicated enough to know that the best things are usually the simplest." Later, Tamia walked out to the greenhouse. Inside, the flowers they'd planted had bloomed. The air was filled with the scent of orchids of rebirth. She gazed at them and whispered, "See, Gary, we survived the winter." He wrapped his arms around her waist. "And I think we'll survive many more." She turned to him, eyes soft and full. "Do you ever think we'd have never met if you hadn't walked down that street that night?" "I do. And I know some things don't happen to test us. They happen to save us." She smiled, brushing her fingers against his cheek. Maybe God chose the coldest night to help two lost souls find each other. They stood there, quiet for a long time. Outside, the New York skyline shimmered in the distance. The storm had passed, but a gentler wave was rising now, the tide of truth and forgiveness. In their hearts, what once was fear had become strength. And in the hush of that night, Tamia knew she was no longer a woman who had to run. She had been seen, she had been chosen, and above all, she had been loved. A week after the media storm, the Bellamy estate had regained its calm. Yet Gary knew the real storm hadn't fully passed. He sat at his desk surrounded by old newspapers. On one of them, the headline still read clearly, "Love or Legacy, the heir's marriage strategy." He stared in silence. The study door opened softly. The butler stepped in, voice low. "Sir, there's a visitor. Mr. Jonathan Myers, the attorney of the late Mr. Charles Bellamy." Gary looked up, brow furrowed. "What does he want?" he said. "It's about your grandfather's old will." Gary's chest tightened. He knew the will, the clause that required him to marry before turning 35 to keep the family fortune. But the word old struck something deeper. "Send him in." Jonathan Myers entered with his steady, deliberate gait. He looked older than Gary remembered, but his voice still carried its familiar strength. "Gary, you look better than I expected." "Depends on the angle," Gary replied. "You're here about the will?" Jonathan placed a leather case on the table and unlatched it. Inside was an ivory envelope, sealed with dark red wax. On it, in precise handwriting, were the words, "To be opened only when Gary Bellamy has married and when he believes his love is real." Gary brushed his fingers over the words. The paper felt warm under his touch. "It's his handwriting." "Yes," Jonathan said, nodding. "He wrote this 5 years before he passed. He asked that I deliver it only when I believed you had changed." Gary gave a wry smile. "And have I?" The old lawyer smiled back. "If not, I wouldn't be here." He broke the seal carefully. Inside was not a legal document, but a few handwritten lines, the ink faded, but still strong. Jonathan began to read aloud, his voice carrying the weight of memory. "My dear Gary, when you read this, I will have found my rest. I have no lessons left to give you about business. The world has already taught you enough of that. I leave you only one question. When you have everything, what will you do with your heart? I set the condition that you must marry before 35, not to bind you, but to see whether you could still listen to your soul. If you marry out of pressure, this inheritance means nothing. But if you marry for love, then every piece of it becomes a foundation to do what's right. Love is the only test I left you. Charles Bellamy." The room fell into silence. Only the clock ticked softly in the background. Gary sat still, realizing what he once saw as a burden had been a test designed not to judge him, but to lead him back to himself. He smiled faintly. He always did like complicated games. Jonathan looked at him gently. This time, he won by helping you lose the only thing worth losing, your pride. Tamia had been standing quietly at the doorway, listening. Tears welled in her eyes, not of pain, but release. "So, you never had to marry for the inheritance," she said softly. "No," Gary replied, meeting her gaze. "I married because I was afraid of losing you." She smiled, a little sad, a little radiant. "Maybe your grandfather knew that only when a man stops calculating does he finally learn how to love." Gary rose, took her hand. "He didn't test me, Tamia. He saved me." Later that afternoon, as Jonathan prepared to leave, he handed Tamia another sealed envelope. "This," he said, "Mr. Charles instructed me to give to the woman Gary chooses if she's real." Tamia looked at him in surprise. Inside was an old photograph Charles Bellamy as a young man, standing beside a dark-skinned woman in a factory uniform. On the back, a handwritten note read, "Thank you for teaching me that dignity isn't in one's name, but in how we treat one another. C.B." Tamia stared at it, speechless. "Who was she?" Jonathan smiled gently. "The first textile worker at the Wells factory, your ancestor." Tamia felt something stir deep inside, like the threads of two destinies, once torn apart, finally woven back together by time. That evening, as the sunset bathed Hudson Valley in gold, Tamia and Gary sat by the window, overlooking the garden where they had planted their first flowers. "Do you see it, Gary?" Tamia said softly. "Everything feels like it was written long ago. We just had to endure enough pain to read the story properly." Gary squeezed her hand. "Maybe. But even if I could choose again, I'd walk the same road, even if it meant losing everything. Even then. Because in the end, I found you." She leaned her head against his shoulder, eyes fixed on the flicker of light outside. "Your grandfather was a wise man." "No," Gary said, smiling. "He was just someone who'd loved deeply enough to recognize who deserved the same chance." They sat in silence. In the glow of candlelight, past, present, and future seemed to merge three rivers meeting at one point. True love. The next morning, Jonathan sent the final legal documents to Gary, along with a note in Charles's hand. "Use this fortune for what brings peace to your heart. Otherwise, it's just gold." Gary closed the folder and turned to Tamia. "I don't want to keep it all," he said. "I'll set up a foundation for those who've lost their homes, their chances, the way you once did." Tamia looked at him for a long moment. "I think your grandfather's smiling somewhere right now." "I hope so." He took her hand, his eyes warm. "You know, Tamia, I used to think he wanted me to marry to protect the fortune, but really, he wanted to protect my heart." Tamia nodded gently. "And he did." Morning light streamed through the windows, touching their faces. The wounds had healed, the past no longer stung. All that remained were two souls, at peace in their truth. Tamia whispered, her voice like a prayer, "Maybe the greatest gift of the departed is teaching the living how to love." Gary smiled and kissed her forehead. "And we'll live in a way that honors that gift." Outside, the wind swept through the greenhouse, brushing the flowers they had planted. Petals fell, drifting in the sunlight like a blessing from another world. A quiet smile from someone who had always believed in them. The night in Hudson Valley was so still that one could hear the faint crackle of candlelight. Spring air had softened, but in Tamia's chest lingered a different kind of cold, one born not of weather, but of fear, the quiet, persistent kind she had carried for years. Gary sat in the living room, reading under the lamp. The light carved gentle shadows across his face, brightness and darkness layered together, much like their lives, luminous and scarred at once. She stepped in quietly. "Gary," she whispered. He looked up, smiling faintly. "Can't sleep?" Tamia didn't answer. She sat down beside him, her hands trembling in her lap. "There's something I need to tell you." He closed the book. "I'm listening." She couldn't speak. Then her voice came, low and deliberate. "I've lived with this fear for too long. The fear that if you knew everything, you'd look at me differently." Gary frowned gently. "Differently how?" Tamia drew a breath. "That you'd see me the way others have. As a woman who once fell, who once failed, who wasn't enough." Gary said nothing, letting her continue. "There are things I've never told you," she said, eyes down, her voice shaking. "Those years on the streets weren't all about singing and surviving on hope. There were nights I had to choose between hunger and humiliation. I never sold my body, but I did beg for food, for a place to sleep, for a chance to keep my son alive. And every time, I felt a little smaller." Her voice cracked. "I used to think, if anyone ever loved me, they'd leave once they knew I'd lived like that." Gary reached for her hand, a light but certain touch. "I'm not leaving, Tamia." She shook her head, tears spilling. "Don't say that, Gary. I've heard promises like that before, and I've watched them disappear. I've spent my whole life trying not to be hurt again. But the more I love you, the more I'm afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Of not being worthy of the love you give me." Gary sat silent for a long moment. Then, softly, "Do you really think love comes with a scale, Tamia? That there are people who deserve it, and people who don't?" She said nothing, tears falling onto her hands. He gently lifted her chin. "I don't love you because you're flawless. I love you because you're real. Because you walked through hell and still kept your kindness. Because you dare to tell me this instead of hiding it." He wiped her tears away, his voice rough with emotion. "You don't need forgiveness, Tamia. You are the forgiveness, the grace that taught me what compassion means for myself and others." Her breath trembled. "Gary, shh." He placed a finger on her lips. "Don't apologize. Don't be afraid. I don't love the version of you the world might accept. I love the woman who sits here, crying, brave enough to be unguarded." She broke down, crying not from pain but from being seen. Her sobs softened, fading against his shoulder. Gary held her close, saying nothing more. In that silence lay a promise that needed no words. "I'm not leaving." When her tears had dried, Tamia looked up. Her eyes were red, but brighter than ever. "You know," she whispered, "all I ever wanted was for someone to look at me and not see a tragedy or a symbol." "See me?" Gary smiled. "I do. And I'll never stop seeing you." Tamia laughed softly through her tears. "I never thought I'd cry like this, not from hurt, but from peace." "Sometimes," Gary said, "tears are how the heart cleans itself." She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm beneath his shirt. "Gary, do you believe love can heal what the past broke?" He answered quietly. "It's not love that heals, Tamia. It's us when we finally let love do it. And you just did." Tamia smiled through the quiet. A spring rain began to fall outside, fine, soft, transparent, washing the night clean. The next morning, Tamia rose early. She stepped out onto the porch, brewed coffee, and breathed in the scent of wet earth. It reminded her of Georgia, the place she'd once left behind with a shattered heart. But today, something inside her felt rebuilt, like someone had laid the first stone of a new life. Gary came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" "I think," she said slowly, "I finally believe I deserve to be happy." He smiled, tightening his hold. "That's the most beautiful thing you've ever said." She turned to him. "Thank you. For not running when you saw the real me." He shook his head. "I've spent my life running from myself. Tamia, you're the one who made me stop." She looked at him, smiling through tears. "I love you. I know. And I love you with a love that doesn't need proof." She placed her hand over his heart. "Do you hear that?" "What?" "That's where I finally found home." They stood there for a long time, sunlight streaming through the window, touching the photograph of Charles Bellamy on the shelf. The older man's face seemed to smile from his frame, as if he knew the final test of his legacy had been passed. That evening, Tamia walked into the garden. The flowers they had planted were in full bloom. The night air was so soft it felt almost imagined. She whispered, "I've learnt now, Mama, that love isn't a reward for being perfect, but a miracle for being honest." Behind her, Gary watched silently. He didn't speak, he let the moment breathe, like a song that didn't need lyrics. Above them, the sky shimmered with patient stars, tiny lights of forgiveness scattered across the dark. And that night, in the old house where two people had once lost themselves, something quiet and holy happened. No one had to hide anymore. No one had to pretend to be strong. They had learned what it meant to be loved, and to let love see them. The first summer after the storm, Hudson Valley bloomed brighter than ever. The fields around the old estate were drenched in green, wildflowers stretching endlessly, their fragrance carried in the wind. Tamia stood by the window, looking out at the garden. Elijah ran across the grass, laughing, his little green kite dancing high above him. His laughter filled the air, proof that winter had truly passed. Gary stepped up behind her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "I have something to show you," he said. Tamia turned. Sunlight fell across his face, calm, kind, serene. He held a small box, wrapped in rough grey linen. "This," he said, "was made by a friend, a metalworker in Brooklyn." Tamia looked at him, curious. "What is it?" Gary opened the box. Inside lay a silver ring, simple, rough-edged, but gleaming as though polished by a heartbeat. Tamia stared, speechless. "Do you remember that little chain you wore around your neck?" Gary said softly. "The one that held that old key ring when we first met." She nodded slowly. "The one you asked me about. And I told you it was the only thing I had left. That night I left the shelter?" "Yes," he smiled. "You said you kept it not for its worth, but because it reminded you that even in chains, a person can still have a free soul." He lifted the ring and placed it gently in her palm. "I had that chain melted down," he said, "and reforged into this." Tamia's breath caught. Her eyes glistened. "I don't want that chain to remind you of captivity anymore," Gary continued, quiet but sure. "I want it to stand for the freedom you fought for and gave me." Tamia trembled, her tears spilling freely now. "Gary, you turned my past into a gift." "No," he said, his tone tender. "You did. I just gave it a new shape." She laughed through her tears. "This ring is more beautiful than any diamond I've ever seen. Because it's real," he said. "Like you." He knelt, sunlight pooling around him. "Tamia Alexandria Charelle," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "You've taught me how to live, love, and forgive. Today, I'm not proposing to complete anything. I'm asking to begin something new. I promise to walk with you, not out of duty, but out of love every day, until my last breath." Tamia's eyes shimmered. "I don't need promises, Gary. Just keep looking at me like you do now, as if I'm the only thing left in the world." He smiled. "I promise." She lowered her hand, and he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, glinting beneath the sunlight like a droplet of silver water. Outside, Elijah called out, "Mama, look, my kite's flying so high." Tamia laughed through her tears. Gary stood beside her, holding her hand, and together they watched. "See," he said, "everything that once bound us now helps us rise." She nodded. "Love, when it's real, always finds a way to change its form." That afternoon, they held a small ceremony by the Hudson River. No reporters, no grand hall, just a few friends, Jonathan Myers, and several homeless singers Tamia once shared songs with. They sat on wooden benches in simple clothes, their eyes warm and honest. Holding a bundle of wildflowers, Elijah proudly played the little best man. Tamia wore a plain white dress, Gary, no suit, just a white shirt and linen trousers. The wind carried the scent of water and weathered wood. When Jonathan read the blessing, Tamia looked up. The sky seemed wide open. "Miss Tamia," Jonathan said slowly, "I'm not just witnessing a wedding today. I'm witnessing the return of two souls who thought they were lost." Mr. Charles would be smiling. Gary turned to Tamia. "I don't have a speech," he said quietly. "Thank you for teaching me that love doesn't prove itself through perfection, but through staying, even when everything falls apart." Tamia smiled softly. "And thank you for never trying to fix me. You only saw me as I am." They looked at each other for a long moment, then kissed. It wasn't loud or showy, just long, deep, and filled with meaning, like two rivers meeting the sea. Applause broke out. Elijah cheered and wrapped his arms around their legs. The breeze stirred, scattering flower petals across the river's surface. Jonathan smiled, reaching into his pocket. He drew out a small folded paper, the last part of Charles Bellamy's will, never before revealed. He read aloud, "If my grandson finds true love one day, I hope he will live to spread it. For wealth will fade, but love when shared makes others want to live better." He placed the note in Tamia's hand. "Keep it," he said. "It's what he wanted you both to remember." Tamia nodded, eyes shining. The house by the river glowed with candlelight that night, no opulence, only warmth. Tamia sat at Gary's mother's old piano, pressing soft notes into the air. It was a song she'd written for him, freedom, their story retold in melody. Gary came up behind her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "You know," he whispered. "If someone asked me what's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, I'd say it's you, singing without fear." Tamia smiled, looking up at him. "And if someone asked me the most precious thing I've ever received," she said, "I'd tell them it's the ring forged from a chain." He lifted her hand and kissed it, the silver band catching the candlelight. "And I'd tell them," he murmured, "that it's proof every shackle can be turned into freedom if you dare to love honestly enough." Outside, the river breeze carried the sound of distant music. The moon shone over the Hudson, its reflection rippling like the silver ring on her hand, soft, steady, eternal. Their story didn't end with a wedding or an inheritance, but with something simpler. Two souls who once had nothing now had each other. A man who once lived surrounded by gold, learning how to love. A woman who once lived in darkness, learning how to be loved. And between them, only one thing remained: light. If anyone were to ask Gary and Tamia what love truly is, they wouldn't answer with words. They would simply hold hands and look toward the sunrise over the Hudson, where the light begins again. Gentle,